Hello, welcome to the video. My name's Josh, and today we'll be looking at one of the 4 archetypes in Darktide, the Psyker. So a Psyker is basically an individual gifted with immense psychic abilities, basically a space wizard. So they'll basically be filling the spellcaster role, usually a backline type of character that's able to deal with hordes and special enemies quite easily. So let's have a quick look through some of the weapons that they'll have access to. So the first of their unique weapons is the Force Sword. This weapon is able to strike hard and fast. It offers some good cleave as well as single target damaging attack patterns. The Force Sword also comes with a fairly unique special attack option where once you press the special button for your weapon, this will start channeling energy into the sword itself, and on your next swing, you'll get stuck in an attack animation where you hold the enemy in place, effectively stunning them for a short turn, and you'll also be dealing a massive amount of damage. So it's very good against single target enemies, but not so good in horde situations. Their other unique weapon is their ranged option, which is the Force Staff. This weapon effectively has 2 functions. The left click will shoot out a small damaging orb, which will deal some okay single target damage. Their other option on their right click is effectively a held charge, where you hold down right click, the longer you hold it, a circle will appear, and it will get larger up to a certain point. And once you press left click, that will detonate the circle and deal massive AoE damage, basically deleting hordes, so this is a very handy tool in your arsenal. Now, you're also not limited to just these weapons. You can also access a lot of the other weapons that are shared between the different archetypes. So these range from things like the Catachan knives, you've also got axes, the chainsword as well, and as for ranged weapons, you'll have access to things like the auto pistol, las gun, revolver, combat shotgun. These are all very solid options, and they do still work quite well with the Psyker as well. They don't just have to be using the staff options. So let's quickly talk about the actual mechanic for how the Psyker works. So basically, when you use certain abilities, whether that's from your weapon or from your blitz ability, which we'll get into shortly, you basically build up what's known as the Perils of the Warp meter. Now, this meter will eventually hit 100%, and if you use an ability while at 100%, you'll be locked in an animation where you can't attack, block, and your movement's usually a bit restricted. And shortly after, you'll actually explode and die and need to be revived by your teammates. But this can be managed by venting your Perils of the Warp. The vent will start out quite slow, just 1 or 2% a second, and it'll eventually ramp up to a point where you're able to vent your entire bar shortly after. Now, the downside to this is you move quite slowly while you are venting. You're usually not able to defend yourself unless you stop venting, and it does take a little while to actually vent your entire meter. Alright, now that we've gone over the basics, we'll get into their kit to see what abilities they actually have access to. So the first is their Blitz ability. Their one in particular is the Brain Burst. This lets them target an enemy, and after a short duration, this ability deals a high amount of damage to the target. Now, for most characters, their Blitz ability is effectively their grenade, which is a limited resource. But for the Psyker, their Brain Burst is effectively unlimited uses, but it does add to your Perils of the Warp, so you do need to manage it by venting from time to time. Now, this is a very handy ability, and it has effectively 2 uses. The first is you can look at an enemy, hold down left click, and within about a second, maybe a second and a half, it'll go off and deal a high amount of damage. For a lot of enemies, this is a direct one-shot. For some of the stronger enemies, it might take 2 to 3 shots, and for the boss enemies, it's just a good consistent source of damage. Now, your other use of Brain Burst is you can hold down the right click and actually charge it up in advance. This takes a bit longer as opposed to the left click option, but it does have the benefit of being able to change the target as you go, so it's very handy if you can hear that there's a special or disable enemy that's going to be jumping on your team quite soon, and you'll be able to just pop their head straight away as soon as they come into your line of sight. The next part of their kit is their aura ability. This effectively works as a team passive. For them, it's called Kinetic Presence. Allies in Coherency gain plus 10% damage to elite enemies. If you're not familiar with what Coherency is, basically when your teammates stick together, you're able to regenerate your shield, or toughness as it's known, a bit quicker, so it's to incentivize teamwork. And with tying in this aura, it also means that your team in general will deal a bit more damage to elite enemies, so again, it really helps with sticking together and working as a team. Next, we have their active ability, which is called Psychonetic's Wrath. This lets you reset your Perils of the Warp meter to 0 and stagger enemies in front of you. This actually has a surprising range and basically works as a force push. The primary purpose, however, is the resetting the Perils of the Warp meter to 0. So this lets you spam out your abilities such as Brain Burster or your Force Sword special attack, or even the Force Staff, and deal a massive amount of damage and purposely go over 100%, and then use your active ability and clear the entire meter and then start over again. So it becomes a very fun gameplay loop where you're able to deal a lot of damage while also resetting the meter, but it is on a bit of a cooldown, so you do have to still manage your Perils of the Warp meter to some extent there. Next, we have their iconic abilities, which are basically passives which can dictate your playstyle a little bit. The first one is Warp Siphon. Killing an enemy with Brain Burst earns a warp charge. Each warp charge grants plus 3% damage. Warp charges are retained for 20 seconds. You can store up to 4 warp charges. So this basically means that you're going around stacking up kills with your Brain Burst and getting these warp charges. They do have a little bit more of an effect based on the feats that we'll go into in a moment, so just keep that in mind. Their second iconic ability is Inner Tranquility, which reduces their perils generated by 10%, so just lets them use their abilities a little bit more without going into the 100% overcharge state. Alright, so that covers the main part of their kit. From what we can tell on the closed beta test, none of those options can be adjusted, but that does bring us through to the feats, which give us some more customization options on how we approach our playstyle with Psyker. So as we can see here, feats are unlocked every 5 levels, and with every unlock you'll have one of 3 options that you can select from each column. These can also be adjusted at any time in between matches, but of course not during a match. So we'll start with the level 5 feat options. These are all based around gaining or regaining your toughness, which is basically a shield mechanic. The first one is Kinetic Transference. This replenishes 50% toughness over 5 seconds on a Brain Burst kill. This is a great option since you'll likely be using Brain Burst quite frequently, and it also helps keeping your toughness up while dealing with those pesky ranged enemies that might be pinging you for damage quite consistently. The next option is Warp Absorption, which replenishes 15% toughness when you kill an enemy with a warp-based attack. This one is great if you're using a weapon like the Force Staff, as you can take out large groups of enemies very quickly with its alternative fire attack. And the last in that row is Quietude, which replenishes 7% toughness for each 10% of perils quelled. This one's a little bit unusual, and I'm just not sure how it holds up compared to the others. There might be a specific build where you're able to quell your perils quite consistently, but from what I've seen, the other two do seem to be stronger options. Now we'll move on to the level 10 feat column. The first in that column is Psychonetic's Wrath, which also shares the same name with the active ability for this class's kit, so a little bit confusing, but bear with me. So you gain between 5% and 15% damage with force weapon attacks based on your current peril. So the higher your peril meter is, the more damage you'll deal with your Force Sword, and Force Staff. Next up we have Inner Tranquility. This feat gives you minus 10% perils generated, but minus 10% quell speed per warp charge. So once you stack up all your warp charges, you'll be generating less perils overall, but your quell speed will be significantly reduced. This will be a bit of a risk reward on this feat, but I think there is an interesting build where you'll be able to build up your warp meter, get all your warp charges, vent using your active ability, and then you'll get a lot of use out of your next set of abilities by just spamming them out and not generating much perils. And the last feat in this column is Rack and Ruin. Killing an elite or specialist with Brain Burst applies 1 stack of agony to all enemies within 3 meters of the target. Now you're probably asking yourself, what is agony? I had a chance to test it on a couple of games, and I'm still a little bit confused myself, and I think a lot of people on the forums are confused as well. Basically, once you kill an elite, it seems like there's a small area of effect fire that spreads to nearby enemies. I believe it's a damage over time effect, but it didn't seem significant enough to notice. It could also just be a bit of a crowd control effect, since I think I did see enemies get staggered by it briefly. But again, it's a little bit hard to tell at this point in the game. Next, we'll have a look at the level 15 options. These seem to tie in a little bit more with your team in general. So the first one we have is Psychic Communion. Whenever you or an ally in coherency kills an enemy, you have a 5% chance to gain a warp charge. So when you're dealing with large hordes of enemies, as long as you're fairly close to your other teammates, this should actually be popping up quite frequently. So this might be an interesting build if you don't want to use the Brain Burst as frequently and you want to just focus more on maybe the Force Staff or just an entirely different weapon. The next feat option is Psychonetics Aura. This gives a 15% combat ability cooldown reduction to nearby allies on an elite kill. So this really benefits both yourself and your team as a whole. For yourself, you're basically getting a reduced cooldown on your active ability, so you can use your warp-based powers much more frequently, and for your teammates they're of course getting the option to use their abilities more frequently, which just helps everyone out. The last option in this column is Cerebral Lacerations. Damaging an enemy with your Brain Burst ability causes them to take plus 15% damage from all non-warp sources for 5 seconds. The primary use I can think of for this one is it seems to be the boss killer option. Basically, you use it on the Plague Ogre once it pops up, and now the rest of your team will be dealing an extra 15% damage to it. And if you have a non-warp weapon yourself, such as a firearm, you'll be able to deal a lot of damage yourself to that target. Now we'll be having a look at the level 20 feat options. The first one is Kinetic Deflection. While below Critical Peril, blocking an attack causes you to gain Peril instead of losing stamina. So this is a very interesting one because a lot of people struggled to get teammates up when they went down during combat. This was mainly due to ranged enemies constantly pinging you for damage, and once your toughness is broken and you're taking health damage, your revive gets interrupted. So if you're able to soak some of that damage using your perils instead of your stamina, and then once it hits critical it starts using your stamina, you might actually be able to get teammates up a bit easier. The second option is Kinetic Shield. You take between 10% and 33% reduced toughness damage based on your current peril. This seems like a good general option for most players to take. And the third option we have is a Mind in Motion. Your movement speed is not reduced while quelling peril. So I mentioned earlier, when you are quelling your peril, you move very slowly. So this will help you get around that drawback. And it also synergizes quite well with the first column toughness talent, Quietude, where you replenish 7% toughness for each 10% of peril quelled. So since you're able to quell without many drawbacks, you'll be able to get your toughness back quite easily as well. Alright, now we have the level 25 feat options. The first one is Warp Battery. This allows you to store up to 6 warp charges. So this actually synergizes quite well with the earlier feat option Inner Tranquility, where you have minus 10% perils generated, but minus 10% quell speed per warp charge. So you can actually get up to minus 60% perils generated whenever you're using a warp-based ability. So that one's quite interesting. Now, the next option is Kinetic Overload. While you have maximum warp charges, gaining a warp charge instead applies a stack of Agony to nearby enemies, prioritizing elite enemies. Again, Agony seems to be a AoE damage over time effect, but we don't have enough data to confirm that at the moment. But this does seem to synergize quite well with the other earlier talent, which is Rack and Ruin. Killing an elite or specialist with Brain Burst applies 1 stack of Agony to all enemies within 3 meters of the target. And the final option we have for the level 25 feat is Kinetic Flayer. All attacks have 10% chance on hit to Brain Burst the target. This cannot occur while at critical peril and has a cooldown of 15 seconds. So that one seems really good for non-warp based attacks. So if you're running a build where you are focusing a bit more on melee, or if you are actually just using firearms instead. Now that brings us to the final column, our level 30 feat options. These are all based around your active ability, Psykinetics Wrath. The first option is Quicken. Psykinetics Wrath removes all warp charges and reduces the cooldown by 12% for each warp charge removed. So if you're able to remove quite a few warp charges, it basically reduces the cooldown of Psykinetics Wrath itself, allowing you to use it more frequently. So this one would be great if you're actually spamming out your warp abilities quite frequently and stacking up quite a few warp charges, then using Psykinetics Wrath to clear your perils, which then in turn reduces the cooldown of Psykinetics Wrath, and then you can just keep repeating that cycle over and over again. So that seems like it would be a very fun gameplay loop. The next option is Agonizing Wave. Psykinetics Wrath expends all warp charges and applies 1 stack of Agony to enemies hit. Enemies killed by Agony have a 10% chance to grant you a warp charge. So this one synergizes really well with the earlier Agony talents, Kinetic Overload and Rack and Ruin. That way you can get a lot of Agony stacks, and again, from what I understand, I believe the more Agony stacks you have, the higher the dot damage. So this would really allow you to stack up a lot of damage over time effects. And in addition to that, Psykinetics Wrath is quite a long-range ability with quite a large area as well, so it would become quite easy to spread Agony over a very large area. And the final feat option we have for this column is Kinetic Barrage. For 10 seconds after using Psykinetic Wrath, your Brain Burst charges 25% faster and consumes 50% less peril. So this feat option will synergize really well with Inner Tranquility and Warp Battery, since you'll basically be able to get 60% peril reduction from those two options, and in addition from this talent, another 50%, so in theory you should actually be generating no perils whatsoever from your Brain Burst ability. So you'll really be able to just spam your Brain Burst ability constantly, dealing a lot of damage to elite specialists and boss enemies. That concludes my overview of the Psyker. Keep in mind everything we've gone over in this video is technically subject to change since it was from the closed beta, but considering the game is also set to release just around the corner, I don't think we'll see any significant changes. I'm also planning to release an overview for the other classes as well, the Veteran, the Zealot and the Ogryn. But yeah, thanks for watching the video guys, and remember to like, comment and subscribe. I'm a new channel, so any support you can give helps me a lot. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.